Deep inside the Bitterroot National Forest along the border of Montana and Idaho, a group of experienced hunters found themselves in serious trouble after an unexpected autumn snowstorm rolled across the mountains. Their GPS units suddenly lost signal beneath the dense pine canopy. Satellite phones displayed nothing but searching icons, and every trail marker disappeared beneath fresh snow. As daylight slowly faded, frustration turned into fear. The hunting party consisted of successful businessmen, former athletes, and outdoor enthusiasts carrying the latest navigation equipment, digital maps, emergency beacons, and expensive survival gear. Standing quietly near the back of the group was an 80-year-old man wearing a faded green wool jacket, heavy canvas trousers, worn leather hiking boots, and an old ranger's hat whose brim had been darkened by decades of rain and sunlight. A polished hickory walking stick rested comfortably in one hand, while an old leather compass pouch hung unused from his belt. Earlier that morning, several hunters had smiled politely when they noticed he carried neither a GPS receiver nor a satellite map. One of them joked, "I guess that's how people got lost 50 years ago." Another laughed, "Don't worry, sir. Technology knows these woods better than anyone." The elderly man had simply smiled without replying. Now, after nearly 3 hours of wandering in circles, every electronic device had failed to provide a reliable direction. Tempers rose. Batteries weakened in the freezing air. Snow continued falling. One hunter admitted quietly, "I think we're walking the same ridge again." Another looked anxiously toward the darkening forest. "If we don't find the trail before nightfall, we'll have to stay out here." The old man slowly walked to the base of a towering Douglas fir and gently rested his hand against the rough bark. Instead of looking toward the sky or searching for a signal, he studied the moss growing along the trunk, the direction of the branches, the pattern of wind-carried snow resting on fallen logs, and the way water trickled beneath a thin layer of ice. One younger hunter watched him with disbelief. "You're not seriously trying to navigate by moss, are you?" A few tired laughs followed. The elderly man looked up with a calm smile. "No," he answered quietly. "I'm navigating by the forest." Before anyone could respond, the distant sound of helicopter blades echoed somewhere beyond the mountains before fading away. Search and rescue teams had begun looking for the missing hunters, but were unable to see through the thick trees. The group realized they might spend the entire night in freezing temperatures unless someone found the correct way home. The old man planted his hickory walking stick into the snow and quietly pointed toward a narrow ridge no GPS map had suggested. "The ranger station is that way," he said. Several hunters immediately protested. "The GPS says the opposite." The elderly man nodded gently. "Then today," he replied, "one of us is going to learn something." Just then, a green Forest Service truck emerged from the trees on a distant logging road below. A uniformed district ranger jumped out, froze the moment he recognized the elderly man, and hurried uphill through the snow. Reaching him, she removed her gloves before firmly shaking both of his hands. "Chief Ranger Thomas Walker," she said with unmistakable respect. "I didn't know you were with this group." Every hunter fell silent. Only minutes earlier they had assumed the quiet old man was simply another retired outdoorsman relying on outdated methods. None of them realized they were standing beside the legendary former chief ranger of Bitterroot National Forest, a man who had spent more than 40 years leading wilderness rescues, training search and rescue teams, and navigating thousands of square miles of mountain forest long before satellites ever guided a single traveler. Hidden inside the worn leather pouch at his belt rested an old field journal filled with handwritten notes collected across 4 decades, along with one sealed letter from the ranger who had first taught him that the forest is always speaking if someone is patient enough to listen. The first day of hunting season had begun beneath clear blue skies in the Bitterroot National Forest, where golden aspens mixed with towering Douglas firs across endless mountain ridges stretching between Montana and Idaho. 8 hunters entered the wilderness before sunrise, confident that modern technology had made getting lost almost impossible. Every member of the group carried the latest GPS receiver, satellite mapping software, emergency locator beacon, digital compass, and rechargeable power banks packed inside expensive hunting backpacks. Walking quietly at the rear of the group was 80-year-old Thomas "Tom" Walker. He wore a faded green wool ranger jacket, heavy canvas trousers, weathered leather boots, and an old Forest Service hat whose brim had faded after decades beneath mountain sun and winter storms. In one hand, he carried a polished hickory walking stick. Hanging from his belt was a small leather pouch that looked old enough to belong in a museum. One younger hunter glanced at the pouch and smiled. "What's in there?" Tom answered politely. "Just a compass." The group laughed. "A real compass?" another man asked. "You actually still carry one?" Tom smiled. "Every day." Ethan Miller, a 34-year-old technology entrepreneur and the unofficial leader of the hunting trip, tapped the GPS mounted to his shoulder strap. "Don't worry, Tom," he said confidently. "This thing connects to 3 different satellite systems. It knows these mountains better than we ever could." Tom simply nodded. "I hope so." For most of the morning, everything went exactly as planned. The GPS units guided the hunters through narrow trails, across rocky streams, and into a high mountain basin known for elk during early autumn. Around midday, however, the weather changed without warning. Dark clouds rolled over the ridgeline. A cold wind swept through the valley. Within minutes, heavy snow began falling, covering footprints almost as quickly as they appeared. Visibility dropped dramatically. The dense forest canopy blocked much of the sky, and one by one the GPS receivers began struggling to maintain satellite connections. Ethan frowned at his screen. Signals getting weak. Another hunter checked his device. Mina just froze. A third tapped the display several times before shaking his head. No position. Snow continued falling harder. The marked trail gradually disappeared beneath a white blanket, while familiar landmarks became impossible to recognize. The hunters stopped beneath a cluster of tall pines and compared their electronic maps. None of them agreed. One GPS pointed east. Another suggested they were farther south. A third insisted they had somehow crossed a ridge they had never even climbed. Ethan forced a nervous laugh. Well, technology isn't perfect. Tom quietly looked around the forest without touching the compass hanging at his belt. He studied the wind moving through the treetops, the direction water flowed beneath a thin layer of ice beside a nearby stream, the shape of broken branches scattered across the ground, and the thick green moss growing along the trunks of ancient fir trees. No one noticed. The group continued debating which GPS was correct. Nearly an hour later, they found themselves standing beside the exact same fallen cedar they had passed earlier that afternoon. One hunter recognized a broken antler lying in the snow. "We've been here before." Silence followed. Ethan slowly lowered his GPS. "That's impossible." Tom gently rested one hand on the rough bark of a Douglas fir before looking toward the surrounding hills. "No," he said softly. "It's actually very common." Several hunters turned toward him. Ethan sighed. "Do you have another suggestion?" Tom smiled kindly. "I'd like to look at a few trees." A few tired chuckles spread through the group. "Trees?" one hunter repeated. "You mean the moss story?" Another laughed. "Come on, Tom. This isn't one of those survival television shows." Tom nodded politely. "You're right." He walked toward the nearest tree anyway. Real forests are much better teachers. He carefully examined the moss, covering one side of the trunk, then looked upward at the shape of the branches, and finally toward a narrow drainage hidden beneath fresh snow. After several quiet minutes, he planted his hickory walking stick into the ground and pointed toward a steep ridge that none of the GPS units recommended. "The ranger station is that way," he said calmly. Ethan immediately looked back at his digital map. "No," he replied. "Every satellite says it's west." Tom smiled without arguing. "Then one of us is about to discover whether the satellites understand this mountain." He gently rested his hand against the tree one final time, or whether the mountain still remembers itself. The group stood silently in the falling snow, uncertain whether to trust the blinking screens in their hands or the quiet confidence of the elderly man studying the forest around him. Ethan Miller looked down at his GPS once more. The map continued refreshing, the location marker drifting unpredictably across the screen before freezing again. "This doesn't make any sense," he muttered. One hunter checked his satellite communicator. Still no signal. Another pulled a second GPS from his backpack. It pointed in a completely different direction. Frustration quickly spread through the group. Tom Walker, however, never looked at any of the devices. He slowly walked toward another towering Douglas fir and gently ran his hand across the bark before looking higher into the canopy. Then he knelt beside a fallen log where thick moss covered one side, while the opposite side remained almost bare. "You're looking at the moss again?" one hunter asked with a tired smile. Tom nodded. "Yes." The man laughed softly. "I thought everyone knew that's just an old myth." Tom smiled kindly. "If someone tells you moss always grows on the north side of every tree, they're wrong." Several hunters looked surprised. Tom continued. But if you spend 40 years studying one forest, you'll notice that moss, wind, sunlight, moisture, snow, and water all begin telling the same story. He pointed toward the hillside. None of them should ever be trusted alone. Then he looked around at the forest. Together, they're remarkably honest. The hunters exchanged puzzled glances. Tom gently brushed fresh snow away from a cluster of low shrubs. "See these?" he asked. The snow accumulated more heavily on this side. Because yesterday's prevailing wind came through that valley, he pointed toward a narrow opening hidden between the trees. The branches above are shorter on the same side for exactly the same reason. He then walked toward a shallow stream flowing beneath thin ice. Water always remembers the mountain. He watched the current for a few seconds before smiling. Every stream here eventually feeds the Bitterroot River. Ethan frowned. "How does that help?" Tom looked at him. "Because I know where the river is." Before anyone could respond, the distant sound of helicopter blades echoed above the clouds. The hunters instinctively looked toward the sky, but the thick canopy completely hid the aircraft. "Search and rescue," one hunter whispered hopefully. The sound grew louder for a few seconds before slowly fading into the distance. "They can't see us," another said quietly. Silence returned. The forest suddenly felt much larger than it had that morning. Tom slowly removed the small leather pouch from his belt. Several hunters smiled, expecting him to finally use the old compass they had joked about all day. Instead, he simply opened the pouch and took out a weathered leather notebook no larger than his hand. The cover had become dark with age, and every page was filled with neat handwritten notes, tiny sketches of ridgelines, creek crossings, seasonal wind directions, wildlife trails, and observations collected over more than 4 decades. Ethan stared at it in surprise. "You wrote all that?" Tom nodded. "One page at a time." He carefully turned to a section labeled North Fork Ridge Late Autumn. Beneath several hand-drawn maps were notes that read, "First snow usually blocks Western Trail. Cold wind funnels through Elk Pass. Moss thickest on eastern drainage. Stream remains unfrozen longest near Ranger Road." One hunter looked at him in disbelief. "You've memorized this entire forest?" Tom smiled. "No." He gently closed the notebook. "The forest taught it to me." At that moment, a voice echoed faintly through the trees. "Tom." Everyone turned. Emerging from the snow came a woman wearing the green uniform of the United States Forest Service. She hurried toward the group before immediately stopping in front of the elderly man. Removing her gloves, she warmly shook both of his hands. "Chief Ranger Walker," she said with obvious respect. "I heard you were overdue, but I never imagined you were the missing hunting party." Ethan looked from the ranger to Tom in complete confusion. "You know him?" The ranger smiled. "Know him?" She laughed softly. "Every search and rescue ranger in Bitterroot National Forest still trains using his field journals." She glanced toward the worn notebook in Tom's hand. "Half of what we teach today began in those pages." The hunters slowly looked back at the quiet old man they had teased only hours earlier. Suddenly, the worn leather notebook, the old compass pouch, and even the moss-covered trees no longer seemed old-fashioned at all. They were looking at a man whose knowledge had guided countless lost people home long before satellites had ever looked down from the sky. Just then, the ranger noticed a yellowed envelope tucked inside the back cover of Tom's notebook. Across the front, written in faded ink, were only a few words, "For Thomas. Open this when someone finally understands that the forest was always the map." Snow continued falling as the hunters gathered around Tom Walker and Ranger Emily Foster. No one laughed anymore. The same men who had confidently trusted expensive electronics only hours earlier now watched every movement the elderly ranger made with complete attention. Ethan Miller looked toward the yellowed envelope tucked inside Tom's weathered field journal. "Who wrote that?" he asked quietly. Tom rested his hand gently on the notebook before answering. "Chief Ranger Robert Hayes." His voice softened with memory. "The man who taught me everything I know about these mountains." Emily Foster smiled. "Every ranger who has served here knows his name." Tom carefully returned the unopened letter to the back of the journal. "He asked me not to open it until someone understood that the forest doesn't hide people." He looked around at the towering trees. People simply stopped paying attention. Ethan lowered his eyes. "I think we're beginning to understand." Tom smiled, but said nothing. Instead, he pointed toward a narrow opening between the pines. "Come with me." The group followed in complete silence. Every few hundred yards, Tom paused, not because he was uncertain, but because he wanted the hunters to see what he was seeing. He stopped beside a fallen cedar. Notice where the snow is drifting. He pointed toward one side of the log. The prevailing wind always deposits more snow here after crossing the ridge. A little farther on, he knelt beside a patch of moss. Look closely. The hunters crouched beside him. The moss is thicker because this side remains cooler and holds moisture longer. He smiled. Not because moss magically points north. Several of the men quietly nodded. Tom continued walking until they reached a shallow stream flowing beneath a thin sheet of ice. Listen. Everyone became still. Beneath the whisper of the wind, they heard the steady sound of moving water. Streams don't become lost, Tom said. Neither do mountains. He followed the current downstream for several minutes before climbing a gentle slope. As the trees began thinning, sunlight suddenly broke through the clouds. Beyond the next ridge lay a gravel road almost completely hidden from where they had entered the valley. Parked beside it was a green Forest Service rescue truck, surrounded by search and rescue volunteers, preparing to continue the evening search. One volunteer looked toward the ridge, then shouted in surprise, "They're here." Within seconds, the rescue team hurried forward. Several hunters laughed with relief, while others quietly embraced one another. Ethan remained standing beside Tom, staring back toward the forest they had just crossed. "We were less than a mile away," he whispered. Emily Foster nodded. The helicopter passed almost directly overhead twice. Ethan looked puzzled. "Then why couldn't they find us?" Emily pointed toward the dense evergreen canopy stretching across the valley. From above, every tree looks almost identical. She smiled toward Tom. "But from down here," Tom finished the sentence gently. "Every tree has its own story." The rescue team leader approached and shook Tom's hand firmly. "Chief Walker," he said respectfully, "we've been teaching your wilderness navigation course for 23 years. He laughed. "Today, you taught it again." As everyone prepared to return to the ranger station, Ethan glanced once more at the old field journal. "Tom," he asked quietly, "would you show us what's inside after we get back?" Tom looked at the notebook before smiling. "I'd be happy to." He paused. "There's one page I've never shared." Emily noticed the sealed envelope still tucked inside the back cover. "Is it the letter?" Tom nodded slowly. Chief Hayes believed there would come a day when people trusted machines more than the wilderness itself. He gently touched the faded handwriting across the envelope. "He told me to wait until I met a group willing to learn that nature isn't the enemy." Tom looked back toward the forest one final time. "Perhaps," he smiled softly, "that day has finally arrived." That evening, a warm fire crackled inside the historic Bitterroot Ranger Station. While snow continued falling outside, the rescued hunters sat quietly around a long wooden table, cups of hot coffee warming their hands as the tension of the day slowly faded. No one talked about expensive GPS units anymore. Instead, every eye rested on the weathered leather field journal lying in front of Thomas Walker. Ranger Emily Foster carefully placed the notebook on the table beside an old brass lantern. "Chief," she said softly, "I think this is the moment Chief Hayes was writing about." Tom looked at the faded envelope that had remained sealed for more than 40 years. His fingers rested gently on the worn paper before he slowly broke the seal. The room became completely silent. Inside were several handwritten pages folded with remarkable care. Tom unfolded the letter and began reading aloud. "Dear Thomas, if you are opening this letter, then someone has finally realized that the forest was never trying to make them lost." He paused before continuing. "People often believe wilderness is dangerous because it is unpredictable. The truth is exactly the opposite. The forest follows the same quiet rules every single day. It is people who arrive believing they no longer need to notice them." Around the table, the hunters listened without moving. Tom turned the page. "One day, people will carry machines capable of showing maps from space. Those inventions will save countless lives, and they should be welcomed, but never allow convenience to replace observation. A compass may fail, batteries may die, satellites may disappear behind storms, yet water will still flow downhill. Wind will still shape the trees. Moss will still seek the places where moisture remains longest. Birds will still choose shelter before bad weather arrives. The forest will never stop speaking." Ethan quietly lowered his eyes toward the GPS resting beside his coffee cup. Tom continued reading. "Teach every ranger that survival is not about defeating nature. It is about learning to become its student. The moment someone believes technology has made them smarter than the wilderness will gently remind them how much they still have to learn." Emily smiled through tears. "He sounds exactly like you." Tom chuckled softly. No. He looked at the letter. I sound like him. He reached the final page. If your greatest lesson is remembered, I hope it is not how many rescues you performed or how many miles you walked. I hope people remember that the forest is not a puzzle to be conquered. It is a teacher to be respected. Tom carefully folded the letter and placed it back inside the envelope. No one spoke for several long moments. Finally, Ethan stood and walked to the front of the room carrying his expensive GPS receiver. He looked at it quietly before setting it on the table beside Tom's old field journal. "This device brought me here," he said. "But today," he smiled gratefully, "you brought me home." Tom gently pushed the GPS back toward him. "Keep it." Ethan looked surprised. "Really?" Tom nodded. "Technology isn't the problem." He smiled warmly. "Forgetting how to observe is." Emily then stepped toward a covered display standing in the corner of the ranger station. She pulled away the cloth, revealing a beautifully crafted wooden exhibit. Inside rested Tom's first ranger badge, his old brass compass, the polished hickory walking stick, several original field journals, and a bronze plaque engraved with the words, "The Thomas Walker Wilderness Legacy," dedicated to the ranger who taught generations that the safest path through nature begins with respect, patience, and attention. Emily turned toward the hunters. "Beginning next spring, every new search and rescue ranger in this district will spend their first day here." She opened Tom's oldest journal to its very first page. Instead of a map, there was only one handwritten sentence. "Before you ask the forest where to go, first ask whether you've truly learned to see where you already are." The room stood together in quiet applause, not for another rescue, but for a lifetime spent teaching people that the greatest guide through any wilderness is not found in a screen or a satellite, but in the willingness to slow down, observe carefully, and trust the timeless language of the natural world. Several weeks after the rescue, the story of the lost hunting party had spread throughout Montana, Idaho, and far beyond. News reports initially focused on the dramatic search operation and the failure of modern GPS equipment beneath the dense forest canopy, but as journalists uncovered the identity of the quiet elderly man who had guided the entire group safely home, the story became something much larger. People weren't talking about a miracle. They were talking about a lifetime of knowledge earned one season at a time. Bitterroot National Forest soon began welcoming visitors from across the country. Search and rescue teams, park rangers, wildlife biologists, forestry students, military survival instructors, and outdoor enthusiasts all came hoping to learn from Thomas "Tom" Walker. Every Saturday morning, long before sunrise, Tom quietly led a small group into the forest, carrying nothing more than his weathered field journal, his polished hickory walking stick, and the old leather compass pouch that had traveled with him for more than 40 years. He never began the class by teaching navigation. Instead, he would stop beside the very first tree and ask a simple question: "What do you notice?" Most people immediately searched for moss. Tom would smile and gently shake his head. "Look longer." Slowly, students began noticing things they had overlooked their entire lives. The direction branches reached towards sunlight, the shape of animal trails crossing beneath ferns, the way streams curved around stone outcrops, the smell of damp soil before changing weather, the pattern of snow collecting behind fallen logs, the songs of birds growing quieter before approaching storms. Only after they had learned to observe did Tom ever remove the old compass from its leather pouch. "A compass tells you direction," he would say. "Observation tells you whether you're paying attention." Months later, the United States Forest Service officially opened the Thomas Walker Wilderness Learning Center beside the historic ranger station. The small museum preserved his original field journals, brass compass, ranger badge, hickory walking stick, and Chief Robert Hayes's letter beneath carefully protected glass. Visitors expected to see maps filled with complicated navigation techniques. Instead, the very first page of Tom's oldest journal contained only a single handwritten sentence: "The forest is speaking every moment. Wisdom begins the day you stop trying to talk over it." During the opening ceremony, Ranger Emily Foster invited Tom to address the hundreds of guests gathered beneath the towering pines. He walked slowly to the front, looking across the crowd of young rangers, experienced rescuers, hunters, hikers, and children. "People often ask whether I trust the old ways more than modern technology." He began with a gentle smile. "The answer is no." The audience listened quietly. "I trust good technology." He lifted his old compass. "And I trust this." Then he rested one hand against the rough bark of a nearby Douglas fir, but more than either of them, he smiled toward the forest surrounding them. I trust the mountain that has been teaching both for thousands of years. The audience rose together in applause. Years later, after Thomas Walker peacefully passed away at the age of 93, every new search and rescue ranger assigned to Bitterroot National Forest began training at the Thomas Walker Wilderness Learning Center. Before touching a GPS receiver, before learning helicopter rescue procedures, before studying digital topographic maps, every ranger first walked a short trail through the forest, carrying nothing except a notebook and a pencil. Along that trail stood small wooden signs, each engraved with one of Tom's observations collected over 4 decades. The final sign waited at the end of the path beside a quiet stream flowing beneath ancient pines. It carried the words that had become the guiding philosophy of an entire generation of wilderness rescuers. Technology can show you where you are. Only wisdom can teach you how to belong there. Most visitors left believing they had learned how to navigate through forests. Those who truly understood Thomas Walker's legacy realized they had learned something much more important. They had learned that the safest path through any wilderness, whether made of trees, mountains, or life's greatest uncertainties, always begins with humility, patient observation, and the courage to keep learning from a world that has been quietly showing us the way long before any map was ever drawn. The story of Thomas Walker quickly spread far beyond the mountains of Montana. At first, newspapers reported it as the remarkable rescue of a lost hunting party after modern GPS devices failed beneath the dense forest canopy. But as people learned more about the quiet elderly man who had calmly led everyone home by reading the landscape around him, the story became something far more meaningful. It was never really about moss. It was about learning to observe. Outdoor schools, search and rescue organizations, national parks, and wilderness programs across the country began sharing Tom's story with new students, not to discourage technology, but to remind them that every useful tool should strengthen human judgment, not replace it. Whenever reporters asked Tom whether people should stop carrying GPS devices, he always smiled before giving the same answer. Absolutely not. He would gently tap the screen of the GPS someone handed him. This is one of the greatest safety tools ever created. Then he would rest his hand against the rough bark of a nearby tree. But this, he smiled toward the forest, has been teaching people much longer. Months later, the National Association of Search and Rescue invited Tom to speak at its annual conference. Hundreds of rescue specialists filled the auditorium, expecting a lecture about wilderness navigation. Instead, Tom walked onto the stage, carrying only his weathered field journal. He placed it on the podium without opening it. When I became a ranger, he began, my instructor told me something I never forgot. He looked across the audience. Never try to defeat the forest. He paused. The forest has already been here longer than you. Soft laughter spread through the room. Instead, he said, become the kind of person the forest is willing to teach. Tom slowly opened the journal. The first page contained no maps, no diagrams, no coordinates, only one handwritten question. What do you notice? He closed the notebook again. Every rescue I've ever completed began with that question. Not with equipment, not with experience, not with confidence, but with curiosity. Years after Thomas Walker peacefully passed away, the original field journal remained displayed inside the Thomas Walker Wilderness Learning Center. Thousands of visitors stopped before the glass case expecting to study advanced navigation techniques. Instead, they found page after page describing ordinary things: the direction of flowing water, the smell of rain before a storm, the way birds change their songs at sunset, the shape of mountain shadows in late autumn, the thickness of moss after long winters. Simple observation, quiet details, small lessons that, when understood together, had saved countless lives. Beside the journal stood Tom's old hickory walking stick. It was worn smooth where his hand had rested for more than 40 years. A small bronze plaque beside it carried his final words: nature rarely hides the way home. Most of the time, we are simply walking too fast to see it. Perhaps that is why Thomas Walker never considered himself a great wilderness guide. He believed he had simply remained a student of mountains, a student of rivers, a student of trees, a student of patience. Because the greatest explorers are not remembered for conquering nature, they are remembered for learning to respect it. And perhaps the greatest lesson Tom Walker left behind had nothing to do with forests at all. In every part of life, when the path disappears, when familiar directions fail, and when every map seems to disagree, the way forward often begins the same way it always has. Slow down, observe carefully, remain humble enough to keep learning, and trust that the world is still quietly showing you the way home.